If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Welcome into the fourth episode of the ATFFBall show. I'm finally back. I know it's been a couple weeks. Sorry about that. Today I'm going to be going over all the transactions made these past couple weeks and how this affects the team's success, along with individual player fantasy implications of those moves. Starting with the quarterbacks, first off we've got Tom Brady signing to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, signing a 2-year $50 million deal. This shocked me more than you can imagine. When you win 6 Super Bowls with a team, I just didn't think there was a chance in hell that he would leave the Pats, but here we are. Last year, the Bucs went 7-9 with Jameis Winston, who, if you weren't following the NFL last year, threw 30 picks. Now, out of those 30 interceptions, 18 came in games where they lost by only 1 score. I don't think Tom Brady is great anymore. However, he also isn't going to throw 30 completions to the wrong team. The fact that Jameis Winston threw 18 interception in close losses shows that the Buccaneers are a team who can win as long as their quarterback doesn't lose them games. I don't think at this stage Tom Brady's the type of quarterback to single-handedly win you a game, but he's also not the type of guy to lose you a game. And with how good the Buccaneers front seven is on defense, paired with their stellar receiver duo, the Buccaneers just need a QB who won't lose them games. Now for the big question on this, how does this affect fantasy football? So Tom Brady's always preferred to throw to the slot guy who works in the middle. So immediately you can take a victory lap if you're a Chris Godwin owner. On the flip side, Mike Evans will take a hit. Throughout his career, Brady's never been known to take shots down the field, which is Mike Evans' specialty. Also, you can't expect Brady to throw 5,000 yards like Jameis Winston last year. It's just not something that happens very often, which means that Brady likely won't be able to support 2 receivers as well as Jameis Winston did for fantasy last year. So I expect Mike Evans to take a dip in production, but still be effective. And for Chris Godwin, I don't know if we can say he'll be better this year because it's hard to do that with the season he had this past year. However, he should be extremely consistent. Now for Brady, his fantasy football production should go up from last year. I think with the weapons he has in Tampa, he can finish as a back-end top 12 fantasy QB. Next up, we've got Ryan Tannehill signing a 4-year, $118 million deal. Holy shit. Eli Manning has made the most money in the history of the NFL, and he made $248 million throughout his career. This is absolutely absurd, the amount of money that Ryan Tannehill, a quarterback who started out last year as a bench warmer, is now going to be making. Talk about securing the bag. Sheesh. But this is good for fantasy. A.J. Brown, Jonnu Smith, and Derrick Henry all produced more when Tannehill was under center. The one player on this team that does not benefit from Tannehill's signing is Corey Davis. Going into last year, I was honestly excited to have Corey Davis on my team as a late-round pick. Corey Davis had a good game early in the season when Mariota was quarterback, but as soon as Tannehill took the team over, A.J. Brown replaced Davis's role in that offense. For Ryan Tannehill as a fantasy football quarterback in 2020, I expect he can finish as somewhere around the QB 10. He won't have the same red zone efficiency as he did this past year, as he was on a historic pace, but he'll still produce with the weapons he has. Hopefully he'll fall to one of those later rounds so we can scoop him up. Dak Prescott was franchise tagged. That's definitely good for Cowboys fantasy production. Phillip Rivers signed a 1-year deal with the Colts. Wouldn't be surprised to see them draft a young guy, let him sit behind Rivers to gain experience, maybe take over the team the next year. I don't see Rivers as a fantasy asset this year. Colts don't have great weapons. Ebron's gone. Hilton can't stay healthy. I just don't think there's enough there to salvage a good fantasy year. I also think this will hurt their running game just a little bit because Phillip Rivers is going to command more of a role. than Jacoby Brissett did this past year. You can also count on him to throw 20 interceptions, which are real drive killers. Next in the news, we've got Kirk Cousins signing a 2-year, $66 million extension. So he'll be on the Vikings through 2022. Now I want to talk about Cousins for just a little bit because with Diggs gone, you can't say that he'll be throwing as many touchdowns. I honestly would avoid drafting Cousins next year, even though the Vikings are my team, unless you were playing in a multiple quarterback league. A couple of the smaller QB transactions. Marcus Mariota went to the Raiders, Keenum to the Browns, and Nick Foles got traded to the Chicago Bears for a 4th rounder. Teddy Bridgewater to the Panthers. Although I don't think the Panthers are anywhere near a playoff contender, I don't think they'll be the worst team in the league anymore as I thought previously. Teddy has never been some superstar quarterback, but he doesn't often make stupid decisions that lose you games. He'll definitely help out DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel for fantasy, though. Now let's get into the wide receivers. Let's start this one off with the big one, the one that shocked us all. DeAndre Hopkins, one of the league's best, if not the league's best wide receiver, has packed his bags and is leaving Houston. The Houston Texans traded a 2020 4th-round draft pick with DeAndre Hopkins to the Cardinals for David Johnson and a 2020 2nd-round pick, along with a 2021 4th-round pick. Without a doubt, a mistake from Bill O'Brien and whoever was with him on this terrible decision. I'd already said in my last episode how terrible of a coach he was, and now he makes the worst trade I've ever seen. Not only did he throw away DeAndre Hopkins for a bag of chips, he also took on David Johnson's contract that he obviously doesn't deserve anymore. On the flip side, for the Cardinals, this is huge. Kyler Murray has a true number 1 receiver to toss the ball to. For DeAndre Hopkins, I think he stays around where he already was in terms of fantasy production. On the Texans side, they acquired Randall Cobb via free agency, so they've got Will Fuller, Kenny Stills along with Cobb. I think Fuller could be a top 24 receiver for fantasy in 2020 if he stays healthy, and still could be a plug-and-play flex start, meaning he's not really a player you keep on your team all year, but if the matchup is good, you could play him. Another big piece of news that came with was the trade of my favorite player, Stefon Diggs. As a Vikings fan, having Stefon Diggs was awesome. At any point in the game, he could catch a 50-yard touchdown that you weren't expecting, and it was awesome. The Vikings sent Diggs and a 2020 7th rounder for 2020 1st, 5th, and 6th in 2020, along with a 4th in 2021. I think both teams won this trade, to be honest. Buffalo got their receiver that isn't 4 feet tall. Minnesota gets rid of some bad locker room drama and receives a haul of picks. For Diggs, I don't think that there will be a substantial difference in fantasy production, but I do think you can expect a small dip in yards because Diggs specializes in catching the deep ball. Josh Allen, although he's got a cannon of an arm, does not throw the deep ball often. John Brown isn't going to repeat his 1,000-yard season. Kirk Cousins will take a dip in points. Josh Allen's to see an increase in production with an added target to throw to. Allen will be a viable fantasy option. Adam Thielen in Minnesota shouldn't see a big difference in targets as he's a slot guy. He's a completely different role than Diggs, so I don't think he's going to see much more production. The Vikings are likely to rely on Irv Smith and Olabisi Johnson a bit more, both 2019 rookies. Emmanuel Sanders goes from one contender to another, leaving the 49ers to go to the New Orleans Saints. Out of all of the free agent signings, I think this one made the most sense. New Orleans has Michael Thomas, who is obviously a top 3 wide receiver in the NFL, but after that, they've got no one. Now, they sign a top 30 NFL wide receiver to pair up with MT. For Drew Brees, he's a top 5 fantasy quarterback for next year. It also helps Emmanuel Sanders, who gets an upgrade at quarterback. The one person that I see this hurting is Michael Thomas. Thomas should still be drafted number 1 amongst wide receivers, but don't expect him to come close to the record he sets this past season. For the 49ers, Jimmy Garoppolo takes a dip, and Deebo Samuel's stocks are going through the roof right now. If you don't follow fantasy football in 2019, Deebo Samuel was a second-half breakout rookie wide receiver. With the loss of Sanders, Deebo should get even more targets, and targets equal success in fantasy football. Last but not least for the wide receivers, Amari Cooper signs a 5-year, $100 million contract back with Dallas, maintaining another weapon for Dak. Next, we're going to move into the running backs. First off, I already talked about the Cardinals trading David Johnson to the Texans, and I think that they show that the Texans are serious about DJ as their guy. Now, David Johnson is not fantastic at running anymore. However, he still is a great pass catcher on a team who likes to utilize their backs in the passing game. This means David Johnson should be somewhere in the back end of the top 15 to 20 running backs this year. Once again, I've said this in the past, all my rankings are in half-point PPR, so I think his pass-catching duties should be enough to support an RB2 in fantasy. Now for Carlos Hyde and Duke Johnson, I think this erases anything that fantasy players could wish for. Next up, we've got Kenyon Drake signing back with the Arizona Cardinals. Now this is big for fantasy, and big for Arizona as well. Last year when Arizona decided to trade for Drake from Miami at the midpoint in the season, not much was thought about the move, but Kenyon Drake fit extremely well into Arizona's system, and I don't see that changing in 2020. Drake is certainly interesting for next year in fantasy, but we'll have to see his ADP, average draft pick, before I can say whether or not he's a good draft candidate. But I mean, especially if they add Tristan Wirfs at pick number 8, another agile offensive tackle to just go with that scheme of running, that's going to be a deadly fit in that team. Melvin Gordon to the Denver Broncos, stirring up the division rivalry even a bit more there. This takes away any bit of a role that Royce Freeman had, and it also severely hurts Phillip Lindsay. You don't bring in a guy like Melvin Gordon for depth. You bring him in because you think he's the future of your franchise. Obviously, they won't completely ignore Lindsay, but Lindsay's not a workhorse. He's far more productive as a 7 to 10 carries in the game. Gordon should get most of the pass-catching roles as well, and you can expect at least 10 carries a game, too. A good move was made by the Los Angeles Rams this past week. They cut Todd Gurley, getting rid of that ugly contract on an injured back. Later in the week, after they cut Devonta Freeman, the Falcons swooped Gurley up. Although I don't think he's great anymore, Gurley will still help Atlanta. They needed a guy who can carry the ball 15 times in a game. But with age and the knee problem, Gurley doesn't have the same skill he used to. But he can still be an RB2 in fantasy. For the Rams, don't be surprised if they draft a guy like J.K. Dobbins in the second. Saving my favorite running back transaction for least, Jordan Howard moves from Philly to Miami, a much-needed move by a team who desperately needs a run game. Howard is the most underrated running back in the NFL. Always a 1,000-yard rusher if he isn't injured, yet people get mad when I put him as high as 18th overall in a post I made a couple weeks back. It's disgusting the lack of respect that Howard gets. He is the definition of a reliable running back. With Howard running the backfield down in Miami, I expect an RB2 season. Last thing that we're going to talk about today are the tight ends. Jimmy Graham was signed by the Bears, extremely surprising to me. Graham was terrible last year, and he's only getting older. Don't bother trying to get him on your team in 2020. Jason Witten signed with the Raiders. This is going to hurt Darren Waller just a little bit. Witten is washed, but you don't bring in a league vet on your team and not utilize him at all. Waller is the number 1, obviously, but who knows if he can repeat another 1,000-yard season. Hunter Henry was franchise tag, no surprises there. Austin Hooper signed with the Cleveland Browns, decimating any value of David Njoku's. Look, Hooper is a fantastic player. He's my favorite at the position. Maybe not as good of a spot as the Falcons was, but it's not the worst. He'll remain a top 6 tight end. And now for the last news of the day, we have Hayden Hurst replacing Hooper's role on the Falcons. Wouldn't mind wasting my last pick of the draft on Hurst as a flyer pick. Won't be great, but Matt Ryan likes his tight ends and usually keeps them consistent. A lot of interesting news in the league these past couple weeks, that's for sure. Well, thank you for everyone for listening to the episode. If you haven't listened to my others, I advise you to do so. I have a mock draft episode and a power rankings episode, so if you're interested in where I project your team to pick and where your team is in the power rankings, go watch those. If you're listening on Spotify, please share the episode. It really helps the audience grow. And the more listeners, the better product I can provide to help you guys win your leagues. Thank you for listening.